And I was so, last year it's a miracle they didn't arrest me because I really let it.
Actually, I was just going to tell you a Utah Phillips story. I wasn't even going to sing one of the songs. So let me stop trying to figure out what key to do a song I wasn't planning to sing. And tell you one of my very favorite Utah Phillips stories that he told about sitting down practicing a hobo song in front of his shack, and a banker lived across the street came over and said very sternly, looking down his nose at poor Utah, saying, looks like every time I look out my window I see you out here wasting your time picking some darn fool hobo song, and I can't help but wonder, aren't you ever going to settle down and get a job? And Utah says, what would I do with a job if I had it? The banker said, well, don't be silly. If you had a job, you'd earn some money. And Utah says, well, what would I do with the money if I had it? He says, well, if you had some money and you had any brains, you would deposit that money in my bank. And so Utah says, well, why, you know, it's hard to tell this story anymore because it depends on looking at the bank as the smart guy in this equation. And talk about times having changed.
No shit.
You'd put your money in my bank. And Utah says, well, why would I put my money in your bank? Well, don't you see, then you'd earn interest, then you'd have more money. I said, well, what would I do with the interest? He said, well, if you had any sense, then you could invest that money in stocks and bonds. So Utah says, well, why would I invest in stocks and bonds? He says, don't you see, if you invest in stocks and bonds, your money starts working for you. Before you know it, you earn dividends on top of your investment, on top of your interest, on top of your deposit. Pretty soon, you'd be able to buy a piece of property. Utah says, well, what would I do with the property if I had it? He says, if you had any brains and you had a piece of property, your problems would be solved. And Utah says, how would a piece of property solve my problems? He says, well, don't you see? He says, you could put up a house or apartments, become a landlord. People would pay you to live there. Before you know it, you wouldn't have to work no more. Utah says, I'm not working now. Anyway,